Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, a podcast bringing students and academics together to explore the research carried out by the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences and the impact this work has on society.
Welcome to the PPLS Perspective podcast, where we talk about the latest scientific research conducted in the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Science here at the University of Edinburgh. This is Dr Charlie Xia, a statistical genetics at PPLS. I'm hosting today's episode on genetics of cognitive ability and socioeconomic status. Our guest today is Dr. David Hill. David Hill is the principal investigator on the MRC project titled From Genetic Sequence to Phenotypic Consequence, Genetic and Environmental Links Between Cognitive Ability, Socioeconomic Position and Health at the University of Edinburgh. David is interested in the use of genetic methods to study cognitive ability and socioeconomic status and how these are linked to health outcomes. David, can you briefly introduce your research for our audience?
Yes, I'm interested in genetic and environmental antecedents of human behaviour and traits. In the past, my research has looked at traits such as personality and cognitive ability. However, I'm also interested in how genetic variation can be linked to traits that are seemingly unrelated to genetic inheritance. These traits would be things such as socioeconomic status, income, as well as educational attainment.
Perhaps a good place to start would be to describe why you think that the genetic differences have anything to do with socioeconomic status, as a common opinion would be that the measurements such as social deprivation and income are influenced by environmental differences rather than the genetic differences.
Absolutely. A common opinion on this is that something like socioeconomic status, as you say, is more to do with the environment rather than one's genetic inheritance. However, it's important to say here that the idea that genetic variation is linked to differences in education or income isn't just from my own work. It's part of a body of evidence that has gone back for about 30, 40 years now, possibly even longer than that. But what I've done recently is to link this genetic variation to specific socioeconomic status traits. But to go back to your question about how such a thing can occur, it's typically through a process known as vertical pleiotropy. So vertical pleiotropy is a type of pleiotropy, whereby pleiotropy is the idea that one genetic variant can have an effect on two different traits. So this can occur when there's one genetic variant with an independent effect on two traits, such as a genetic variant that would make an individual or be linked to an individual, that is to say, being both taller and having a higher body weight. However, there's also a type of pleiotropy called vertical pleiotropy, which is what I think applies here. And vertical pleiotropy is the idea that one trait can cause another trait. Therefore, if there's genetic variation that influences the first trait, that same genetic variation will be linked to the second trait. And you can see an example of this when we consider traits such as dyslexia, whereby dyslexia might impact upon one's level of education, a socioeconomic status type trait. And if genetic variation influences dyslexia, then the genetic variation that influences dyslexia will also influence educational attainment through its effects on dyslexia. And this same phenomena of vertical pleiotropy is very likely to be the process by which something like income has a heritable component, whereby genetic differences that are linked to different aspects of personality or health play a role in the jobs people select and how much they can earn. A good example of this is if you think about, in terms of genetic variation linked to health, if you miss fewer days in school and if you miss fewer days at work due to poor health, then you're likely to get a higher education and with that better qualifications to be able to select jobs that have a higher level of income. Of course, that's not to say that genetic variation is the only effect to take place here, but it is possibly the means by which genetic variation are linked to these differences in non-biological traits.
Interesting. So income is a heritable trait. Well, in your genetic study of income, did you find the money gene?
This is one of the questions that we get asked quite a lot with our genetic studies. If one gene is associated with traits such as height, or in this case income, like you say, the money gene. So income is like any other trait in the sense that it's heritable, which means that some genetic variation is going to make a prediction on phenotypic effects, phenotypic outcomes, how tall you are, how heavy you are, and how much money that you earn. But importantly, there's no one single genetic variant that's going to be responsible for these effects. These traits are what's known as polygenic traits. And for an example of this is an example of how this works. Is if you were to go outside in the rain, and when you come back in, and your friend asks you, "Oh, which drop of rain got you wet?" you can immediately see, well, this is not a sensible question. It's not a single drop of rain that gets you wet here. Rather, it's the cumulative effect of many small raindrops. As this is how it works with something like height as well. There's no height gene in the sense that there's no money gene. It's not one single genetic variant, but the cumulative effect of many small alleles, which all have a small, on their own, insignificant role.
What inspired your interest in studying the genetics of socioeconomic status?
Well, my interest in studying socioeconomic status comes from when I was studying my master's degree on cognitive ability and its relationship with physical and mental health outcomes. So there are multiple reasons about why something like cognitive ability could be linked to physical and mental health. So cognitive ability is linked to physical and mental health in the sense that individuals who score more highly on cognitive tests are typically those who also have fewer instances of heart attacks, and as well as better mental health as well, fewer mental health episodes. But this link could be due to a number of different reasons, one of which is that individuals with a high level of cognitive ability are better able to understand and utilise health information, the concept of health literacy. And also there's the idea of the system integrity hypothesis, where both a high level of cognitive ability and better health are the product of a body that is more robust to environmental insults. There's also the idea that cognitive ability is one of the traits that drives differences in something like socioeconomic status, where those with a higher level of socioeconomic status find themselves with better access to higher quality healthcare, as well as less stressful work environments, better housing, better food. And so the differences in cognitive ability could be due to something to do with differences in socioeconomic status.
You recently conducted a study looking at the effects of socioeconomic status on change in brain structure in elder age. Can you take us through your research?
Of course. This research was looking, as you say, to see if differences in measures of socioeconomic status have an effect on the structure of the brain in older age. And this study was part of what's known as a genome-wide association study, whereby we're looking at genetic variants from across the genome to see if particular alleles turn up more often in those with a higher level of our measures of socioeconomic status. And what we were measuring in this instance was a broad measure of social deprivation called the Townsend score, educational attainment, household income, and what sort of job an individual has, that is to say, their occupation. And we were looking to see if specific alleles occur within higher level of education, higher level of occupation, higher level of income, more often than in lower levels. And what we found in this instance is that the genetic variants that were associated with any one of these measures of socioeconomic status was also associated with the others as well. And so this finding was the idea that different measures, seemingly different measures of socioeconomic status, actually seem to tap into the same genetic architecture. That is to say, the same genetic variants that are associated with education would also be associated with income and occupation as well. And so from this, we were able to derive a single genetic measure capturing these differences in socioeconomic status. So once we had these genetic variants that were linked to measures of socioeconomic status, we were able to use a technique called Mendelian randomization. And this Mendelian randomization technique is a technique by which we can get closer to the idea of causality in our study designs. So when we typically want to understand causality, what we run is something called a randomized trial, whereby, for example, if you were testing the efficacy of a certain drug, you would divide up your participants into control and case groups. and this would be done randomly. However, we can't randomly allocate socioeconomic status to individuals and follow them up across their lifespan. But what we can do instead is use this Mendelian randomization technique. And so, using the genetic variants that were associated with this general genetic factor of socioeconomic status, we can treat those variants as part of a randomized control trial, because at conception, these genes are randomized between members of the population, within families specifically. And so rather than randomly allocating individuals to control and case groups, we measure the random allocation of alleles for socioeconomic status at conception. And using this technique, what we identified was that those individuals with a higher level of socioeconomic status also had fewer instances of, or a lower level of white matter hyperintensities. And these white matter hyperintensities are non-pathological markers of aging. When we're young, in our adolescence and young adulthood, we typically have very few of these white matter hyperintensities. But as we age, we get more and more of them. But the number that we have is predictive of cognitive decline in older age, as well as high blood pressure, and they're also linked to dementia. So although these are non-pathological, they can indicate pathology later on in life. And so the results of this study indicate that this socioeconomic status, lower levels of socioeconomic status act as a stressor, which seems to indicate that they are causing these non-pathological aspects of brain aging to be accelerated in individuals with a lower socioeconomic status.
Sounds very complex to me. So during the study, what are some of the challenges?
I think one of the main problems with conducting studies in socioeconomic status and genetics is making sure the results are communicated in a very clear fashion. So it's very easy to misunderstand what these genetic associations mean, particularly with regards to something like genetic determinism. So genetic determinism is the idea that if you have a genetic variant, then you are destined to have the trait that it is associated with. In this instance, if you have genetic variants associated with low socioeconomic status, that means you are biologically determined to have low socioeconomic status. Well, this just isn't what our research indicates at all. The genetic variants themselves have a small effect on socioeconomic status. In total, it was explaining, that is to say, associated with about 10% of the differences in socioeconomic status. This doesn't mean that it explains 10% of any individual's socioeconomic status, nor does it mean that the genetic variant will always influence these socioeconomic status in the individuals. One of the previous findings we've seen in other groups, a particularly interesting finding about how the same genetic variants associated with education can and can't have an effect depending on the environment that they're in, is the findings in the Estonia biobank, whereby they looked at genetic variants linked to education before and after communism. And what they identified was that the genetic variants facilitative of education did not predict education during communism, but did predict it afterwards. So this indicates that if you change the setup of a society, you can change which genetic variants would be associated with these outcomes. That is, again, to say that the role of the environment can't be neglected in something like this. The magnitude of the genetic effect is a product of the environment that you find it in.
Interesting. I think at this point, the audience are curious about which one are more important, the environment or the genetics.
It's a good question, and one we have quite a lot. It's important to say that in our study on socioeconomic status, the environment did explain the greater proportion of variance. Socioeconomic status, genetic effects on socioeconomic status were associated with about 10% of the differences in socioeconomic status, meaning that the other 90%, a bulk of those 90% are going to be associated with the environmental differences, although we did only measure a subset of the total genetic variation, that which is commonly found across individuals. Yeah, it's important to note as well here that if you change the environment, you're going to change the differences in the genetic effects that you find. I mean, we previously talked about the Estonia example, whereby you have the same genetic variants, and their association, whether or not they're associated with education or not, depends on the environment that you find them in.
Last question. So what's the impact of the studies? How can it benefit the real world?
Well, the impact of a study like this, there's no real-world policy implications that come from studies like this. It's quite a long way from anything like this. It's important as well to look at some of the techniques that we have here. So what you can do with the genetic variants that are linked to socioeconomic status that you can't do by just studying socioeconomic status phenotypically is the Mendelian randomization technique that I mentioned previously. So normally with these observational studies, we can't really make any sort of claim regarding causality. MR allows us to make some, MR being Mendelian randomization, allows us to make some tentative claims about what causes what. In this instance, that socioeconomic status seems to be causal of brain health in older age. We can also look at the combined effect of multiple genetic variants added together into something that we refer to as a polygenic risk score. Now, a polygenic risk score is an individual level prediction that describes the total number of variants linked to SES within any one individual. So whilst these can't be used to predict on the individual level, even though they are individual level predictors, we can begin to make some tentative predictions regarding socioeconomic status based on individuals' genetic inheritance. And when we apply or look at applying this to traits such as educational attainment, it might be possible to identify and predict which children are more likely to struggle in school and implement some sort of additional education to ensure that they can live up to their potential.
It's a very meaningful and interesting study indeed. Thanks, David. That's all we have time for this. This is PPLS Perspective Podcast. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Take care of everyone and see you next time.